Okay, right. Let's get going. Welcome, everybody. I'm Tony Burns. I'm one of the co-directors for the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice. I'm going to chair this evening's session, which is a lecture, of course, by Andy Higginbottom on Marxist Capital Volume 2. So we're scheduled to finish 7:30, and Andy usually lectures for about 50 minutes or so, don't you, with half an hour or so for discussion afterwards. So without further ado, let's get on with it. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you very much. And I do want to repeat my really sincere thanks to the CSSGJ for hosting these, because it makes a huge difference, I think, to have both a friendly and a professional platform. So I'm just sorting my own slides out. Okay, so this is the second lecture, and it deals with chapters 3 to 6. I've just got stuff coming up on my screen. Okay, I'm just clearing it up. Okay. If you haven't seen lecture 1, you will need to go back to it. I'll do a quick review of lecture 1, but I'll move on to chapters 3 and 4, and then 5 and 6. Now, chapters 1 to 4 kind of form a unity in that they all look at what Marx called the circuits of capital. And then he moves on to looking more specifically at circulation, which is, if you like, markets, money and commodities changing hands. And these two together form part 1, the metamorphoses of capital and their circuit. So volume 2 is in 3 parts. So with this lecture, we'll finish introducing the first part. There are some pretty obvious applications for what Marx has been telling us, just to try and get a different way of seeing what he's doing. And there's some very sort of contemporary applications of his work, especially on circulation, which we'll come to toward the end of the lecture. I'm going to, there's in the reading groups, there's one sort of point of view which has cropped up, and I will respond to it, which is Heinrich's interpretation of value and exchange value, which I think is normally debated around the first part of volume 1, chapter 1, in fact. But I think because Marx actually does use a similar type of analysis here that he did use in the first part of Capital Volume 1, it gives us sort of evidence which can affect our views of this debate with Heinrich. So I'll come back to that at the end. And then, of course, we will have time, as Tony already said, for some evaluation of the process and discussion. Okay, so let's review the first 2 chapters, which I talked about last time. And you've been reading this now, and the whole emphasis is very much on a cyclical movement of industrial capital in the sense of capital which directly involved in the exploitation of workers. But what Marx is actually saying is, in order to play that role, industrial capital has to go through other stages in its sort of cycle. And so the emphasis is very much on how it transitions from one stage to another. And this is very, Marx presents this very much as a process through 3 distinct forms. So you have the 3 forms, and you have a metamorphosis going through them. What is going through them? What's the content here? Is capital, which is presented here as expanding value. It's not just value going through process. Through this process, capital expands. And so it's not just about movement. The movement is also about increase. And this increase of the value as it goes through the process, the increase in value, Marx gives the term valorization, increasing value, valorization. The circuit has got 2 phases in circulation and 1 phase in production. Now, each of the 3 forms, and the forms are money capital, commodity capital, and then commodity capital again, and productive capital in between. Each form, the way Marx positions this, each form has functions by which the capital moves from one form to another. And this is what we looked at. We'll look at this again a little bit just to confirm that point. Now, my observation about this, and it's definitely there in the text, is that each of these transitions from one form to another requires a relation. It's not just about the individual capital in isolation from the rest of the world, sort of mutating under its own genetic code, if you like. It can only mutate if it's successful in establishing relation with other entities. In the case of the market exchanges, it's buying or selling. In the case of the production process, capital has to be successful in order to expand in exploiting labor in the production of commodities. So each phase, each transition is not only about process and form, it's also about relations. The source of capital's expansion through this cycle is surplus value that comes from the exploitation of labor. So the essential relation is the exploitation of labor, and the objective form of that exploitation is surplus value. And surplus value is an essence which appears in circulation as money. So what Marx is doing here is he's actually using a very similar form of analysis, which is this very forensic, detailed attention to form, which he already carried out at the very beginning of Capital. You'll remember 20 yards of linen are worth one coat in chapter 1. But so it's that type of analysis, but he's actually applying it to the content which he addressed in part 2 and beginning of part 3, which is how capital moves from circulation into production. And of course, in volume 1, Marx uses that transition to explain what surplus value is. So he's doing a similar thing here, or he's looking at similar material, I should say, but he's looking at it from a different perspective, which is the question of circulation. And what he's actually doing is, instead of looking at commodities as value forms, he's developed a concept now because he's looking at them as forms of capital, or capital forms, if you like. So he's using the same method, which is form determination, but rather than starting from the commodities which are the products of labor, which is where he started in volume 1, he's starting from capital and how capital moves through these different forms. This concept of capital form is sort of under-recognized, I would say. It's actually a very important concept in the development of Marx's exposition. Okay. The other thing that Marx brings out in chapters 1 and 2 is that the circuit is considered from distinct starting points. He looks at it as beginning from money capital, and then he looks at it as beginning from productive capital. And in doing that, different aspects are brought out, and we're going to continue in that vein with commodity capital. Okay, there's a point which I sort of noted in passing, but I'm going to just emphasize a bit more. This is more for the record. If you've seen lecture 1 and you've been looking at this material, you might find the symbolic representation, it needs some deciphering. And the notation is as follows, that Marx has sort of invented. So where there's this horizontal dash, that's an exchange. So money is exchanged for commodities, and there is an exchange of equivalent values, equal values are exchanged. Where he draws these 2 lines, that denotes not an exchange. It denotes, the notation is similar, but actually means quite a different thing. What he's denoting here is a subdivision of commodities, but of 2 different subcategories. So the commodities that are bought are either labor power or their means of production. And you'll probably remember that in volume 1, this would have been variable capital and constant capital. Okay, so that's that aspect, those 2 aspects of the notation. And then Marx moves into the production process, and he separates out production with these dots. Because what he's emphasizing here is that it's a very different character. It's no longer circulation. We're moving into a different type of process, a process of a different kind, right? So it's a very distinct, it's the labor process, it's the production process. But what comes out of the production process is, again, commodities. And these commodities are denoted with a C prime. C prime has a greater value than C. And
Okay.
C prime has a greater value than C. And this increased value, Marx brings in another notation here, which consists of the original value of the original C plus a new value, which he denotes as small c, as an increase in value in the commodity form. And so C prime is exchanged for M prime. So that's an equal exchange. And again, there's the M prime is more money than the original money. So we've got the original money plus an additional amount of money. Okay. Just to emphasize this, it's quite important that this is fully grasped. So the first phase here is an equal exchange of values. And the last phase is also an equal exchange of values. So how comes there's more value? The more value arises in production. The substantive increase is in production. It presents itself in commodity prices and is realized in their sale. And when the commodities are sold, the surplus labor that's been carried forth in the form of the commodities is turned into money. Okay, so just lastly on notation, I'm slightly laboring this point, but just for almost for the record, and if you are just doing a catch-up or reading on your own rather than a group, we discussed this in some detail in the groups, right? So Marx is using a normal notation of deltas, which is sort of like increase in, okay? So C is C plus delta C. It actually should, the text, I think there's a slight copy editing error. That should be C prime is C plus delta C, given Marx's notation. But he also alternatively has C prime is C plus small c. So I forget numbers he's using, by the way. He's talking about commodities in the form of yarn. His example would be 10,000 pounds of yarn, and the value of this 10,000 yards of yarn would be 500 pounds. And the 500 pounds is made up of 422 pounds, which is the original means of production and variable capital, plus an additional amount. Now, you will easily be confused because he switched the notation from the notation he used in volume 1. And you'll recall in volume 1, the commodity product in volume 1, he denotes by constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value, where C plus V is what is been used up and S is the surplus value. Okay, so in effect, S in volume 1 is the same as this small c in volume 2. Okay, and of course there is a reason that Marx would be minded to change notation. It's because he just also can then emphasize the change of form. But in the English translation, we've got two completely different uses of small c. Okay, and in volume 2, when you see small c, you have to look in the context, but normally it means the surplus value that appears in commodity form. So the mode of analysis here is not only that commodities are produced by labor exploited by capital, it's not even only that capital in a different sense is the producer of commodities. What he's saying here is that capital takes the form of commodity capital. Okay. There are a couple of extra points. When you go back to this C plus V plus S in volume 1, you might notice that Marx actually gives two alternative representations of that. And that happens to be a very big clue to what he's going to develop in volume 3, which is a difference between the product of labor exploited by capital and the product of capital exploiting labor. It just switches the view of the relation. But that's a kind of an aside. Now, in the methodology lecture at the end of volume 1, I explained this sort of idea of the spiral of the exposition, but looking at it not side on, but end on. So it's circular. So Marx introduces, first of all, the commodity is the product of labor. And then he looks at the commodities product of labor being exploited by capital, and that's how capital gets profits. And then thirdly, he looks at the way the capitalist mode of production really works, which he gets to in volume 3. Now, in this, I've just gone through it quite quickly because you need to go back for a sort of a more methodical step-by-step explanation. But I realized when I looked at this again that I kind of jumped over what happens in volume 2. So if I rewind this backwards, this here is volume 2, where we look at the essential forms of appearance of capital. So I'm opening up this up in the next slide. Okay, so we roll forward again now. And so this is this is just a sort of a representation of what's going on in volume 2. This first circuit, okay, Marx starts with money capital. The money is advanced and the capitalist goes to the market and they buy labor power and they buy means of production. And so they're doing this for a purpose. And so the form of money capital has the functions of purchasing labor power means of production. And the purpose of that is to set up production on a capitalist basis. Okay, so the outcome of this is the beginnings of the role of productive capital. In production, as we know, production time or labor time in production is split between necessary and surplus labor time. And because of that, the commodities that are produced have a surplus value over and above the value of all the inputs into them. And so this is contained in the first instance in the commodities bearing surplus value. This is the C1. And then, of course, to realize that surplus value and the value overall, the commodities have to be sold. So you've got a return to the marketplace, but this time the capitalist is acting as a seller. And when the commodities are sold, you're back to money capital at the end. Except, of course, this is now M prime. In other words, it's more money than the capitalist started out with. So this, I've just tried to represent what I think Marx is telling us in terms of the circuit of money capital. Okay, so that finishes the review. Now we move on to what Marx is telling us in chapters 3 and 4. And again, we have this notation, which I guess you'll be becoming quite familiar with by now. We start off with C prime now. We're not starting off with money. We're starting off with the commodities that have just been produced in a capitalistic fashion, right? Okay, so what are the particularities of this way of looking at the circuit? Well, it is the product of the two earlier ones, but Marx says it's not only that, it's also the beginning of a new circuit. He's starting this view with commodities that have just been produced. And what he's thinking here is there is this, what's the word, this posits, this begs the question of what's going to happen when these commodities are sold. Is the money going to be reinvested? Is there going to be production on an expanded scale? Okay. The circuit of commodity capital does not just open with capital value, but expanded capital value in the commodity form. And thus it includes from the start, not only the circuit of the capital value present in the commodity form, but also that of the surplus value. So he uses, I didn't actually put it in the quote, he uses the term pregnant, right? So what you've got is an extra additional value already present in this commodity form. Now, when you read through the text, you also have to be quite conscious of something I already mentioned, how Marx is using a type of analysis which he started with at the very beginning of Capital in volume 1, chapter 1, right? And you may remember the difficulty that is possible to have with his use of the equal sign. because he says that 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat. Now, in the text here, when you come to commodity capital, he's using the equal sign in exactly the same distinctive way that he did at the beginning of volume 1. And the equals should be read here. This is another notation point, but it is really important one because it's one which can lead to very big misunderstandings if you don't get it right. The equal sign here means is worth. So when Marx says that 7,440 pounds of yarn equals 372 pounds, he's saying it's worth that much amount. That's an exchange relation even before the act of exchange itself. Okay, so this is these are the components in his example of this 500 pounds worth of yarn, which is not yet sold. It's still worth 500 pounds, but to actually realize the 500 pounds, it will need to be sold. But it's in a sellable state. It's got a price tag on it. So the money form is present in the ideal forms of price tag. And this is exactly a repeat of what he was saying in volume 1, but now explicitly in a capitalistic context. Okay, so this commodity capital, just as we saw with the original commodities, has got a dual aspect. That's use values, it's also value. And the only way that value comes out, if you like, to the public, appears on the marketplace is an exchange value. That is value. The exchange value is the form of value, the 372 pounds, 50 pounds, and so on. So the commodity is both use value and exchange value. Now, Marx pauses for some reflection a little bit. He's trying to distinguish between, okay, so what's distinctive about this circuit when we start off with commodity capital rather than when we start off with money capital or productive capital? And he brings out different characteristics. When he looks at money capital, he emphasizes this thing about valorization, the additional value, the expansion of value. When he starts from the point of view of productive capital, he emphasizes that this brings out the issue of reproduction. Okay, so now we have, he says, okay, so what differentiates third form from the two early ones is that this is the only circuit that the valorized capital value and not the original capital value still has to be valorized, right? So the increase in surplus value has already happened if you start with C prime, okay? And that's he sees this as a particularity of this circuit, which is clearly the case. How significant it is kind of like, you know, for discussion, and he develops that, right? So as with, yeah, this one doesn't add very much. Okay, he makes the argument here, which, to be honest, I'm not totally convinced by, but he sticks with it, and he does stick with it through volume 2, right? What he says is, in the form of C prime, you're going to have other capitals of various kinds. You know, you're going to have machines, coals, etc. So he's saying this is the most convenient or most apt way in which you can aggregate the total social capital. Of course, you can aggregate from any form. You could aggregate all the money and say, well, add all the money up of all these individual capitals, and then you've got the total money, the total capital. We could add up all the productive capital and say, well, that's the totality of, you know, they're different perspectives. Or you can say you add up all the commodities that are produced, and that gives us a view of the total social capital, which it does, but I think it's from a particular perspective, and we'll come on to that. So chapter 4, he tries again to bring these three together. He looks at what's common to the three different circuits. I mean, these circuits have, all of them have this issue of how continuous they are, because it's sort of stop-start. I mean, there is the succession of stages, but how smooth is the transition from one stage to another? Okay, so this question of continuity and the question of possibilities of interruption as in the transition from one state to another, or even within one form of capital or another, it is a sort of a big issue in this way of conceiving of capital as a process, right? But another point, a very important point he brings out, is that this, when you actually look at it, capital isn't just starting off from productive capital and going around that way, or just starting off from money capital and going around that way, or just starting off with commodities waiting to be sold, going around that way. It's all of the things at the same time, right? All the balls are juggled and they're in the air. Okay, so it's a continuity, it's the unity of capture the overall process. We need to conceive of it as not only as a continuity of the circuits, but a unity of the circuits as well. Now he makes what I think is a very crucial reflection at this point, and I'm actually going to turn it around the opposite way to the opposite way to the way Marx makes it, right? So he says, right, capital as self-valorizing value does not just comprise class relations. It is a definite social character that depends on the existence of wage labor. It is a movement, a circulatory process through different stages, which itself in turn includes three different forms of the circulatory process. Hence, it can only be grasped as a movement, not as a static thing. What he's saying here is you need to, what I'm telling you in volume 2, you need, as well as what I've told you in volume 1, I think more or less, right? It's not just a class relation, it's this process, this movement through forms. Now, I think the current state of academic debate, or maybe I should say Eurocentric debate in the main, is actually the problem is assumed more and more the other way around, right? Which capital has been seen as a process through forms. But much of the commentary forgets that these processes require class relations. Okay, so I actually make the point the other way around. Now, Marx is kind of like says this in those who consider autonomization of value as a mere abstraction forget that the movement of industrial capital is this abstraction in action. This is his phrase, right? Here, value passes through different forms, different movements, in which it is both preserved and increases, is valorized. So the notion of capital of abstraction in action is also got some vogue in Marxist academic commentary. Again, most of the commentary in volume 2, and there's not an awful lot of it, but most of it writes about value as processing forms. But it's a process which leads to an expansion of value. Marx makes some supplementary remarks. The one that I actually find most open to challenge, I would say, is that he assumes that money is metal money, and he excludes symbolic and credit forms of money. I think that just doesn't work. I think his fairly developed sense of the circuits of capital don't work with just metallic money. You're going to need at least symbolic money, i.e., I mean, he's denoting this stuff as pounds, right? He's saying I've got £500. Capital starts off with £422 and ends up with £500. I think there's an inconsistency in the text there, right? He doesn't say capital starts off with 1.8 ounces of gold and ends up with 2 ounces of gold, right? The gold is represented in symbolic form. There's been a standard of price. The British state has said, you know, there's 2.4 ounces of gold in £1, or whatever it is, the other way around, actually. But you see what I'm getting at, right? So I don't think I think he restricts money overly, given that it needs to work with how money works with commodities. These further observations from Marx towards the end of this chapter are very interesting, right? He does return to the issue of the world market. And the fact is that industrial capital can bring in commodities from all over, and it can sell commodities to all over. So the question of the world market, both as selling into industrial capital and buying from it is an important issue in Marx's time. The other really interesting observation he makes is you can think of each of these starting points or each of these circuits the standpoint or perspective of each of these forms of capital. That might be a better way to put it, right? You can see the influence in different economic views. And he basically says, well, classical economists really take the standpoint of productive capital. If you go back earlier, actually, and Kane, his standpoint was really of developed commodities that have been already produced. And he looks at others as well. And I mean, really what stands out is for Marx, the sort of like the immediate clear essence of capital shows most in the circuit of money capital, because it's money that breeds money. Okay. He has quite a lot to say about capitalist commodity markets, which I will. He reverts to volume 1 notation just for a minute, but I'm just going to leave that. I'm most interested in this last point, right? What he's saying with Sismondi and the missing analysis based on the expansion of capitalist money. This is a seed of how Rosa Luxemburg understood the capitalist mode of production, which is very much based on volume 2. And again, it's also the seed of the critique of Rosa Luxemburg's interpretation, which is extremely well argued and well-meaning, I would say. It's got a very good motive behind it, but it misses the further development of the perspective of the profit driver. And that is the problem with it. Okay. Oh, big pause. If you're watching the recorded, you can take a break now. If you're not, you just have to suffer my granddad joke, because we're just having a big pause. That's dealt with chapters 3 and 4. And I'm now going to deal with chapters 5 and 6, which are kind of like they have their own unity. So Marx is shifting the mode of analysis now. So pause, reflect, let's move on. Okay, in chapter 5, Marx is looking at circulation time. He actually starts, although the chapter's called circulation time, he actually starts with production time. You imagine, right? Basically, the capital in process is either in circulation twice or it's in production, right? So it's going to spend time in each of these forms. What Marx does is he first explores production time, and he reduces production time by 2 steps. The first step is, well, production time is, there's something less than production time, which is the time in which the capital is actually active. There's an active capitalist production process. So you think of a factory, which maybe they don't work all the time. Maybe they don't work at night. Maybe they don't work at weekends, right? So, I mean, the capital is still held. It's still part of this productive capital phase, but it's not active in the production process. Okay. You think of another category, which is, you're going to need some stocks. You're going to have those cotton bales coming in. They're piled to one side, and they're not actively in use until they're ready to be put to use, right? So there's going to be interruptions in the production process. There's interruptions of a very particular type, which Marx brings out, which is especially if the production process uses natural processes. I mean, I think of cheese, right? Gorgonzola sitting on the racks as it ferments, whatever it does to bring out its taste. Well, the same with wine and corn. Animal husbandry is also part of this. So natural processes, okay, are set in motion, but go ahead without constant human attention. So that means that the working time can be less than the process time. While the wine is in the cellar, the corn is growing and so on. Then they're not all the time being attended to by the workers. So there's a sort of latency to aspects of productive capital, especially when you look at the raw materials. They're hanging around waiting to be put to use. This is another sort of reason why why the working time is less than the process time. Okay. In the intervals in which productive capital does not function, produce neither value nor surplus value, hence the drive towards night work. So he's basically saying, well, this is not very efficient from a capitalist point of view. So capital wants to reduce this gap between working time and process time, and as much as possible saturate all the process time as actually active working time, and the same with production time. But the transfer of value from content capital isn't only the active labor process. It's about all the time that these elements are actually been invested in and pass their value over to the commodities that have been produced. So depreciation is depending on the type of means of production, from like 1 or 2 years often for computers to maybe 20, 30 years for buildings and 10 years for machines and so on, right? But then that is the overall production time is being taken into account there. Okay. Yeah, this is a bit like I was talking earlier. He's saying that when, if we think of the wine or the cheese, when it's being on the shelf and not much being done to it, you only think of the value added at the moment that the worker is actually working with the stuff, right? While the stuff is fermenting or acquiring its taste properties, that's not active additional labor value. It's not value being added. It's the use value changing, but not value being added. The capitalist tendency, if means of production absorb no labor, then they absorb no surplus labor. Hence, there is no valorization of the productive capital as long as this finds itself in that part of its production time that is in excess of the working time, no matter how inseparable these pauses may be from the accomplishment of the valorization process. So you have to have active labor present for valorization, is what he's saying. It is clear that the nearer production time and working time approach to equality, the greater the productivity and valorization of the given capital in a given space of time. The tendency of capitalist production is therefore to shorten as much as possible the excess of production time over working time. And this is a very good anticipation of how Marx anticipates a sort of certain logic of efficient use of organization of time, if you like, which became known as just-in-time production methods. Now, we're looking at also, so that so far is capital time in production, okay? Now he looks at the time that capital spends in circulation, right? And these processes are processes of circulation, are processes of simple commodity metamorphosis. What he's saying is we are talking once again about buying and selling of equal values, equivalents, okay? During its circulation time, capital does not function as productive capital and therefore produces neither commodities nor surplus value. He thinks that the fact that capital must be involved in circulation, so capital has to be involved in circulation, but at the same time, that's not where the surplus value is produced, okay? But he argues that because capital has to spend time in circulation, this can give rise to a certain illusion that actually profits spring from circulation. Political economy sees only the appearance. Okay, the illusion it seems to provide that is political economy with the proof that capital possesses a mystical source of self-valorization. So, because circulation is necessary, he argues that this gives rise to the illusion that this is where the value is actually produced. And he says it is an illusion, right? That is independent of its production process and hence the exploitation of labor. That's the point. It separates out the source of the value, of the new value, from the exploitation of labor. And of course, this is an inclination of capital to see it this way, right? But there is more to it than that, because actually the way capitalists have to calculate profit is they have to look at capital which is involved in circulation. They do have to look at the time and the cost of circulation in order to work out their rate of profit. But that's a shift. It's a shift away from surplus value towards the realized form of surplus value, which is profit. Okay, and again, it's a major anticipation of volume 3. where he sort of brings these threads together and looks specifically at profit. Okay, so, well, I am inviting you there to read page 204, because there are other reasons for this illusion to appear. So you might want to look at those with some closeness. So circulation is both selling and buying. Okay. What he says is that the selling is more difficult stage for capital of the metamorphosis. For any individual capital, it's harder to sell stuff than it is to buy stuff. You want to, I invite you to think about that and discuss why that might be, right? But circulation is just as necessary for commodity production as is production itself. And so capital needs to have agents of circulation. It needs people whose job it is to do the buying and to do the selling, okay? There are a whole series of specific issues that he's beginning to anticipate now what the next chapter is going to be talking about, right? Which is the issues that arise of holding capital in a commodity form before it's actually sold. And that's the next chapter. So I'm on the last chapter that we're going to be looking at. And so we've looked at the time of circulation. And now what Marx does is he looked at the cost of circulation. And he divides these costs into three broad categories, okay? The first category is pure circulation costs. And while the commodities are being sold or being bought, there's some labor goes into looking after them in that state, okay? Or rather, no, that's not quite right. They spend some time in that state, okay? And the fact that they spend time in this state is not adding any new value. But the fact that capital has to be advanced to keep them in these while they're being bought and while they're being sold, this adds to its costs. Now, again, I'm slightly critical of the way Marx deals with money in Volume 2. I think he is not fully consistent. But one point he makes, which is a good point, is the first point here is right? He looks at the production of gold. If you think about the production of gold, it's already money. So when the gold produces, that what they're producing directly is money. They're not producing a commodity which is different to money and has to be exchanged with it. They've already got gold, right? So he gives this a different symbolic form, right? There is no C. There is no C prime. It's already money. Okay. So that's a particularity. That's a uniqueness of gold production if gold is the money commodity, right? The commodities that function as money go neither into individual nor into productive consumption. They represent social labor fixed in a form in which it serves merely as a machine for circulation. So he's talking about, this is a separate point, he's talking about the use of gold as money, right? But he says, well, in circulation, it's neither an individually consumed, nor is it productively consumed when it functions as money, right? Of course, people can consume it. They can decorate their necks with it, or they can put it on integrated circuits. But in the way of it in its role as money, it's not being consumed, right? But I think this is, again, a bit dubious, right? Because it's not being used as the machine for circulation, right? Really, right? It's symbolic money which is being used there, okay? But he sticks with this argument. And if the argument holds, it is insofar as money, commodities are needed to keep the circulation process going, then they're an overall cost to social wealth, right? A part of social wealth, a part of productive capacity just has to be used in order to get stuff, gold, to be used in this circulation process. And that's my comment. Right. Taking this slightly out of order because bookkeeping what's the word, invites pictorial representation. This is Bob Cratchit from quite a good version of the Christmas Carol. Now, in this particular picture, in the program, he's actually writing letters. But what the bookkeepers did in those days is they generally had massive ledgers, where the great big books where they would record, in triplicate probably each and every transaction of the business. So that took time, that took labor time and the ink and all the rest of it as well. Okay. Now, what Marx is harping back to a point he made about money back in volume 1. This is not actual money in a sense of I see either pound notes or gold. What you see is ink marks on paper, and this is money of account, right? And it's a way that the capitalists will control the production and the selling process, right? In effect, what they're doing is using it, and very often they use it in order to calculate costs and in order to derive prices, right? It's very important for price calculation, this money of account, right? Marx makes an interesting point here. He says this type of bookkeeping, of course, it may be not the old Bob Cratchits these days, there are more developed means of bookkeeping available, right? But actually, in any rational control of production, you would need some form of money of account. And in fact, in a communal production, communal society, it would become more important because it would be part of the withering away of money in its other forms. This is just an aside from me. If you think of the way accounts work, and this is a very typical type of sort of modular view of the type of accounting systems that are available, right? It actually mirrors almost to the T of what Marx has been talking about. So you'll have a purchase ledger, you'll have a sales ledger. Purchase ledger has suppliers, sales ledger has customers. These are brought together under the general ledger. This is an abstraction. I mean, all the commodities are sold in exchange for money. This is a real abstraction: customers, suppliers, products, and so on. And stock control, we'll come on to stock. The cost of storage is the second category of Marx's three costs of storage. It actually is quite surprisingly, you might think this is a very mundane topic. Marx actually finds quite a lot to talk about in terms of the cost of storage, which I'm not going to go into in a lot of detail, right? But I'll give you a summary of this at the end. But his main point here is, of course, again, we saw it with hoards. I mean, hoards are part and parcel, or reserves are part and parcel of the circulation of money capital. And storage is part and parcel of the circulation of capital in the commodity form. Capitalists need storage, right? So that means that the role of storage is to make sure that the commodities do not lose their value before they're sold. That's basically what it is, right? It is very interesting that Marx conceptually brings in the concept of the ideal again, right? Those circulation costs that proceed from the mere change in form of value from circulation in its ideal sense do not enter the value of commodities. So he's talking there about purely the change of form of exchange value. And this is he brought in the idea of ideal in the concept of price as a prefiguration of the actual sale. And of course, these costs of storage, this is before the sale. So this is part and parcel that we've got use values and exchange values that exist before the actual exchange with money. Yeah. I think I'm going to be quite quick on these. It's a slight slippage toward the end, I know, but you will read this. It's not conceptually, it's not, I don't think, quite so demanding as the circuits of capital, right? But he says there's different ways in which stock can be held, right? It can be held by the capitalist. It can be held stock on the point of purchase, stock on the point of sale. So you've got stock of raw materials as well as stock of the finished goods. Then he moves on to something which is quite important, right? How much stock is required depends a lot on the development of the means of transport and communication. And the more that that's developed, the less stock is required. Okay, and then again, I'm just going to skip these, I'm afraid, right? Because I do want to come to the summary. The third category is transport costs, which is extremely well, I think, explained by Marx. And I think what he basically says is we're in the sphere of percolation, but this is production because it's still adding value. So Marx separates these types of costs into three. There's pure circulation costs, which are necessary but do not add value. There's storage costs, which prevent any loss of value. And he sees this as being a cost which is part of the social productivity of labor. It kind of like the more storage you need, the social productivity of labor goes down, right? And then he sees transport as being a form which adds value to the commodities. So I'm coming to the end now. I think this is penultimate slide. So there's pretty obvious applications of this. There's a very interesting, very contemporary literature, which is really dealing with transport logistics under the latest phase of imperialism, sort of globalized imperialism, became a new sort of important topic with lots of aspects to it, military aspects. Originally, transport was the many countries, the first formation of the working class, as such as a wage worker class, was in transport industries, dock workers, rail workers, and so on. So there's a lot of points about the nature of transport, which is, in Marx's text is immediately germane to. Is also a very big, important starting point if you look at other sectors. One of them being narco trafficking, because you got to look at the movement of circulation of money, as well as the circulation of the product. And so you can do a commodity chain analysis on drugs, but you have to also look at follow the money, basically. And my last slide. I mean, this is all ammunition as far as I'm concerned, or ammunition. This is all material which lends itself to a different interpretation than that which is argued by Heinrich. Heinrich argues that the validation in exchange is part and parcel of the formation of value. It's necessary, but it's not where value is created. So it is absolutely true that the commodities need to be validated, that there is a use value for which people want to buy and spend money for, right? But that's assumed in Marx's analysis here. And there is a very big underlying point, of course. So any individual value capital may not manage to sell its commodities, and there will be a loss of value. But rather more importantly, the system as a whole may go into crisis because capitalists cannot sell their commodities. And that's a much bigger point. Okay, we can talk about how to read this stuff in the discussion. So yeah, I end the lecture. It's that's the end of part 1.
You're on mute, Tony.
Yeah, I realize it. Thank you. I'm now unmuted. Thank you very much, Andy, for that. Right. Okay. Brilliant. We have half an hour or so for discussion, questions, etc., etc. So perhaps if you electronically raise your hand, that would be helpful to me. I think I can sort of see what's going on. Should I stop recording? Actually, I don't. What do we usually do when I can't remember actually whether we carry on recording or.
Most people don't seem to object. I mean, for me, I would stop recording because but I mean,
it allows people to say things which, if it was being recorded, they might be a bit more reserved about.
Yeah.
Possibly. Mind you, I don't think this particular topic's going to. You've not been talking about Gaza or anything like that. So. But, well, let's leave it. Let's let it run. Why not? But yeah, okay. So, does anybody have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do appreciate. As normal, I sort of rushed a bit toward the end, but sorry.
No, it always takes a while for people to get going, doesn't it? Well, I perhaps I'll ask you something. It was something you said about one of the formula. You said the production of gold is the production of money. I can't remember exactly when you said that. Yeah, there's one of the formula. There was a symbol missing because it wasn't necessary to include it because the production of gold is regarded by Marx just is the production. Well, I was just wondering whether about that actually. I mean, I guess one common sense view might be, well, the production of gold is the production of a yellow metal, which can actually serve as money, of course, in certain contexts. But it's probably, it's a big claim to say that literally is the production of money, isn't it? I mean, I think that it's not obviously true, is it? Really? I mean,
yeah, I know. I do appreciate the comment. I mean, his phrasing is quite careful there. He says,
right.
I can't remember the exact beginning of the sentence, but it's something like, I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember word for word, right? But he says, insofar as it's used as money, the production of it, right? So that's
okay.
why that
Okay.
there's a
Yeah.
qualification in there. So it does
Yeah.
allow for
Right.
individual consumption or productive consumption.
Sure.
But I mean, I think certainly productive consumption has expanded massively in recent years with electronics, basically. But even Marx's time, there's clearly a lot of individual consumption of gold because gold is wealth. So it's kind of like part of luxury consumption. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Andreas, I see you have your hand up. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andy, for yet again very clear exposition. And I mean, I agree with you in your interpretation of Marx that while he says bookkeeping and storing is in a way unproductive labor, it doesn't add value. He then says that transportation would be productive labor. And I think you're right, yeah, that's what he says, but I'm just puzzled by it because in a way, this is just part of the circulation and the selling, the realization of the surplus value, yeah, but I find it difficult to understand in what sense transportation would add value while storage wouldn't.
Yeah, yeah, there are definitely three categories here. I mean, definitely the bookkeeping and the money. He says that's just because of the capitalism that you got those in that form. Although he also says even there, right, in any rational system of production, you would need some form of bookkeeping. So yeah, I think they're all a little bit arguable, to be honest, right? But in the case of transport, there's this distinction between the commodity is a unity of its value and its use value. And what he's saying is transport adds to the use value. Yeah. Because something on the other side of the world, the other side of the country is of no use. You can't sell that. What you've got to sell is you've got to sell it to the person who's buying it. And certainly when you get to the retail stage, that's, me wanting the shed delivered to my front garden so I can put it up in my back garden, right? So the shed is no use to me in storage in Cheltenham. So the fact that somebody puts labor into loading it up onto a lorry and there's capital involved in the lorry as well and delivers it to me, that labor adds value to the commodity. So the location of the commodity is part of its use value. That is more or less his argument. And of course, for me, I think that holds, right? For me, I actually have a bit more of a problem with the storage and transport, because very often storage and transport are so interconnected. I mean, transport is a form of storage, if you see what I mean. Right? It is an interesting, I mean, this logistics stuff is amazing. And you see, I mean, we said we want to talk about Gaza, but you see what's happening in the Red Sea right now. There's this whole discussion about the interruption of these extremely crucial for the world capitalist system, these supply lanes, right? And you may have followed it in the press, but the actual cost of transportation are incredibly low. They're saying it actually doesn't matter too much because it's I don't know, it only adds, I don't know, something like $7 a ton or something if you have to go around the Cape, go around Africa, run through the Red Sea. I mean, I don't know. I think it's $7 a ton. That's a figure that seems to stick in my mind, right? Well, probably it depends a ton of what, of course, but a ton of stuff could be like worth thousands of dollars, right? So I think these are quite small percentage points because capitalism has found efficiencies in transportation on a huge scale.
Okay, thank you for that, Andreas. I noticed, Patricia, you posted something in the chat, but perhaps you'd like to just say it. Feel free.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. I was listening. Thank you so much for the lecture. And I'm very much into this warehousing and the logistics revolution type of literature, and also actually into Heinrich's understanding of Marx, which is sometimes, I guess, a little bit different with that what has been traditionally made of Marx. But I was like Andreas, I was like wondering, this difference between transport and storage. Of course, Marx was talking at another time in history, and perhaps, you know, that storage was very different probably from what we now understand happens in Amazon, for example, or in any other big warehousing and logistical company. But I was interested in your, because you mentioned so many of the sources at the very end of your presentation, and you seemed quite excited about the use that has been made of Marx in that literature. Could you elaborate a little bit? I think it's very important. We are in de-industrialized countries. We have basically outsourced a lot of our production to other parts of the world, and then logistics, all of well, we have talked for 15 years about the experience economy and immaterial stuff, but all this time we are importing massively goods from elsewhere. So we are not in no way less dependent on commodities. They are just produced elsewhere. But then logistics and circulation becomes a very, very central element in a system of production that is globalized, and where you know, things are produced in part here, and then they move, and then they are reassembled, and then they are moved again in to another place. So I would like to hear some reflections on this, starting, of course, from Marx's principles.
Yeah, that's a very helpful comment, I think, actually, Patricia. I mean, there is a lot involved here. Okay, so the whole question of the efficiency of the transport links and the sort of the huge investment in logistics is itself predicated on the global shift of production to China and the Far East, right? So, I mean, what's underneath it is super exploitation of workers in, you know, Eastern countries in particular, Asia in particular, not only China, you know, sort of we were looking today at 10 years after the fire, you know, in Bangladesh. So you're talking about huge quantities of clothes being shipped from one side of the world to another. And what Marx said about gold as being a necessary for capitalism, but actually a social cost, you know, the fact that, you know, time and resources have gone into its production, you could say about transport. I mean, at one level, this is crazy, right? I mean, stuff is being produced. It's a capitalist logic entirely, right? It's a rationality of lower cost and greater profits, right? But it is crazy that, you know, I can buy a pair of gloves in the local supermarket for £5, and they're nice gloves. They're not, you know, they're good quality, made in China. This is the world we live in. And I mean, you can go and buy green beans from Peru or Kenya, you know. So it's completely normalized. And we are, well, I'm not quite sure where you are, but I'll speak for myself. I mean, I would say that we are become normalized into being a consumer. You know, our interface with capitalism is much more as consumers than as producers, right? So of course it is understandable, you know, and the expansion of Amazon and so on, right? I mean, this is the global division of labor is generating these sort of, you know, filling in these gaps, and clearly Amazon's been very good at it and make a lot of money out of it. I do think that the question of Amazon workers, I think Amazon workers are, well, all workers can be exploited wherever they are, whether they're in circulation or production, by the way. I mean, being producer, you can be a worker in sales and still be exploited, although you're not creating value. It's just that the cost, you know, you're costing less than you would have done if you'd been paid a full wage for the cost reduction. That's how they make their profit, right? But the Amazon workers in store, I mean, I do think there's a line blurred. I actually do feel a bit, you know, the conceptualization of the Amazon worker. I mean, where does storage begin and transport begin? You know what I mean? I think that they merge basically. So, I mean, in terms of literature, I don't, you know, I like the stuff I've read from, I've forgotten her first name, but Chua. I think she's the one, as far as I could see, who's tried most conscientiously to link the categories of Volume 2 to the modern day logistics industry. I mean, there's a previous literature which I just haven't referenced, but I mean, if you know the stuff, all people can look it up, right? I mean, before logistics, there was just in time. I mean, there's a whole literature of just in time stuff, which is similar, but you know, it's a bit like early, about 15 years ago.
But, yeah, I come from critical organization studies, and just in time is often looked at within the organization, right? Of course, it is. I mean, I was really enjoying that you referred to that when you were reading, because it was exactly, I immediately thought about it. But I think the logistics revolution literature really takes another level of analysis, which is much more aligned to the, to this circulation, this idea of circulation. I see another hand up, so I won't, because I can go on and on, of course.
No, that's fine. There is a sort of a methodological point, which, I mean, I do appreciate what you're saying. I think it's very interesting and, you know, of the moment. There is a methodological issue which we should all be aware of. And this is that you can see, when you read Capital, you can see parts of it with a direct relevance to today, right? So in volume 1, you can see when he writes about, you know, about women working in sweatshops, right? It's directly relevant to today. It's kind of like it could be written today, okay? But there's also this issue, there's a related issue which we have to be quite careful of, right? Which is you do need to understand the whole as well in order to fully appreciate how you bring it to bear on any particular case. And that's why I'm a bit sort of almost conservative this morning about this. I do think we need to get to volume 3 to really understand and apply it to what's going on. Because in the end, it's about profit. You know what I mean? If they make profit out of it, they'll do it. I mean, they'll kill hundreds of thousands of people if profit is to be made out of it, right? So the logistics thing only works if it's profitable to do so. And clearly they can make it a big profit out of it. So it's not only about the circulation, it's about the determination of profit, is all I'm saying.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Patricia. So, Walter, you've been waiting very patiently. So, over to you.
No, it's fine. Back to the question of transportation or transport costs. What about public transportation? Doesn't that serve the effect of bringing labor power to the point of production? When labor power, if it's sitting at home, cannot be put to use. So wouldn't public transport costs be productive?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. And I don't think we got this from Marx. I think we definitely have to develop from Marx to understand this. The debate that I know about is it came up in a slightly different way, but I'll come back to the way you're raising it, right? So what about health systems and the reproduction of labor power? So you're talking about, you know, on a daily basis, but on like a generational basis, right? And if the capitalist health systems first came in with nurses in factories, at least they did in France, which is the case study I read, right? And it's kind of like it was directly to help the capitalists keep the workers working, you know, don't let them, you know, it's like keeping the machine going, keep the worker going, right? And then as a right, I mean, especially after the Second World War, certainly in Britain and I guess other countries, the, you know, the right was extended as like a social pact. So within health services, there's a double, you know, it doesn't resolve down neatly into one category in terms of these value categories, right? Part of it is clearly a social gain, which is actually got to be drawn out of the general surplus value of the entire society. But then in another sense, it actually does help to keep the cost of labor power lower, right? Because it means that, you know, you want to go private, I tell you, no ordinary working class person can go private in terms of healthcare system, right? There has to be a system which keeps the cost lower. And so I do see public transport, you know, I'm ad-libbing a bit, but you can see it in a similar way. There's a general benefit, but there's also a specific benefit of reducing the cost of the reproduction of labor power. Yeah.
Well, similarly too with education, public education, like public health.
Yeah, I mean, all these things are deeply contradictory, aren't they? Because, you know, on the one hand, it's, you know, capital needs labor power and they need educated workers and they need healthy workers and they need workers at the right place at the right time. But at the same time, they're living human beings. And so there's this, you know, duality of the whole thing.
Thank you for that, Walter. So, Tim, I can see you've got your hand up. Over to you.
Just a brief illustrative point on that. I mean, obviously in COVID, the political importance of keeping schools open and the keeping the transport links working was this celebration of critical workers, that kept the infrastructure running, became a real issue quite openly. And so the value, and productivity and profitability of those services began to come into focus. Schools were being looked at in a very different way. End of point.
Yeah, I appreciate it completely. I mean, that was such a class, the class structure was like, it was like a flare going up. It showed you who works and who works in different ways and what ways they work, what they have to do to work. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, against the epidemiology, which recognised that the schools were a major transmitter of the virus, so that, I mean, fraught with contradictions.
Yeah, completely.
Thank you for that, Tim. Andreas, you've got your hand up again.
Yeah, perhaps just to follow up on that. So in a way, of course, capital relies on transport. Workers need to come to the factory. Capital relies on public education. Capital relies on public health services because you want a functioning workforce. But these contradictions perhaps also indicate how within capital and capitalism, there are these potential for alternatives, because public education can also grow into something else. A health service can become something beyond the needs of capital, as can be calls for free public transport. And so perhaps that's also then where the kind of potentials for alternatives can emerge, because these areas can never be completely subsumed under capitalist exploitation.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, they're definitely huge terrains of struggle. I mean, I know the NHS, but I mean, health provision in the United States, very different kettle of fish, right? And if you don't have medical aid and stuff, if you're working class and, haven't got bought into the program, the degree of healthcare is completely disastrous as far as I understand it to be. Yeah. So you got, the social gain of a public health system that's basically supported by the state is a real one. But then, of course, what you've got within the British health system is there's all kinds of privatizations going on within it, right? And so there's opportunities of profit making. And I mean, it's quite a complex area. The broad categories, right, are labor which produces surplus value, productive labor in that sense, and productive for capital. Okay, and labor which doesn't produce it but helps realize it or move it around, if you like, the surplus value. I mean, there's a whole other category here, just by the by, which is when Benetton went to Argentina, wanted to go to Argentina, the World Bank wrote a study saying, look at all this unproductive land, it's completely, wasted because it's not producing surplus value. And that was kind of like an ideological framing for Benetton to move in and take over indigenous land and, use the sheep for its wool products and stuff. So it's productive for capital rather than for society. That's the it's a capitalist domination. Productive me equals producing surplus value.
So I can't see any hands up, so perhaps I'll ask another question. It touches on this issue of transport that Andreas first raised, and the labour that is involved in that sphere, let's say, and whether it does add value or not. I was wondering what, in the course of that discussion, I was thinking, well, in volume 1, Marx talks about the value. He associates it with the notion of socially necessary labour time, and the idea of social necessity. It just seems to be, at first sight anyway, to be suggesting, well, if there's no market for it and it can't be sold, then of course you've sort of wasted the labor that goes into the production of a commodity, and so in some way or other, although we're talking about the production of value, sort of market relations somehow or other sort of interfere, as it were, or need to be taken into account. And I was just thinking about this idea of demand for a commodity. I suppose if you unpack it, I mean, you could connect that to transportation, because efficiency or a lack of it insofar as the transportation of commodities is concerned, it will have an impact, I think, on, well, what economists call effective demand. You know, sort of, and so it's not obviously implausible to say that could actually reduce the value of a commodity or increase it, depending on how efficient the transportation process was. I don't know what you think about that.
No, I think no, that is completely true. I mean, the greater the productivity of labour in transport, I mean, is it cost £7 a tonne to bring stuff from China, or £700 a tonne to bring stuff from China? So if it's £700, they're not quite so cheap, the gloves anymore, are they? So yeah, it's completely relevant what you're saying, and I mean, and there's competition. You know, this is an area of competition and technological innovation. All the computer controls and all the rest of it are moving chips around. They all come into play here. Yeah, you're quite right about this. Something else. Yeah, I mean, just taking a slight step back. Okay, I mean, Marx's theory of value is an extension of the classical political economy tradition, right? And after Marx, there was a counter-revolution from bourgeois thought, right? And it's important to sort of note, right, because Marx has an objective theory of value, right, which is socially necessary labor time is an objective fact. Okay, you can't directly measure it. You do have to measure it via the medium of money, but that doesn't change its objectivity. It just makes it a bit more complicated to get to the reality behind the money, right? But you know, the whole thing with the marginalist neoclassical counter-revolution is that they wanted to overturn this objective view of value. So in Marx's view, demand does affect value. I mean, you quite actually say, but it's sort of like there's a principle and, if you like, a secondary kind of thing going on there, right? I mean, whatever the demand is, it takes more to produce an aeroplane than it does to make a safety pin. You know what I mean, right? I mean, there's an objectivity to the difference. Right? You can sell a lot of safety pins, but it still don't have greater value than an aeroplane. Whereas, I mean, it is absurd, but it's true. I mean, the bourgeois economics basically is based on a subjectivity about, well, value is what people want it to be. If they want it, it's got value, right? So there's a sort of there's a regulator to supply and demand within Marxist theory, right? Supply and demand move around some kind of degree of objectivity level.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you. So do we have, oh yes, Tim, you put your hand up. Okay, over to you.
It's slightly frivolous, but as an extension of that point, I don't know if there are professional marketing people here, but I mean, there's a joke about advertising. You know, there are two forms of advertising. One, letting people know of new products which didn't previously exist, so you have to announce their presence. And the other thing is selling excess commodities that people don't actually need, but the capitalist needs to flog. And then there's the question that half of advertising has some purpose and it produces an outcome, and half of it doesn't, but no one knows which is which. but the serious point is that, you know, that if you like, the consumer cultural aspects of capitalism is incredibly overblown. You know, the pressure to get people to buy and consume on a scale beyond real, tangible social needs is part of the process. And it's about profit. I mean, as an industrial designer, I was trained about inventing products, not for the need to satisfy needs, but to satisfy the manufacturing capacity of production. You know, Advanced Packards, the waste makers, was a social critique of, you know, the industrial design profession, as was Victor Papanek's Design for the Real World. You know, a lot of creative activity goes into generating market need, which is actually socially not justified, you know, and hence adbusters, you know. Anyway, slightly frivolous point, but but it's not inconsiderable, and it causes a lot of ideological confusion.
Oh, I agree with you, and I do think this is there is a sort of a trajectory of political economy, or Marxist political economy, about this as well, right? Because I mean, advertising is not really part of capital. He doesn't write about advertising, okay? He's talking about yarn, and I mean, okay, capitalists compete with each other, but you don't really see much about trying to outsell each other with adverts and stuff. But it is an organic part of capitalism and mass production, absolutely so. And you know, in particular, after the sort of the big capitalist boom in the United States in the late 19th century, you know, it becomes an integral part. And you know, some of them stuff like, you know, Barron and Sweezy monopoly capital and stuff. I mean, they had a point, right? Which is, you know, car manufacture is, you know, there's always got to be the latest model, the 1964 Ford, the 1965 Ford. So this is brand differentiation, and then the corporations themselves become the brand. You know, and so there's, yeah, I think these are real developments, and of course it's also extremely, you know, the dynamic of it between some parts of the world and other parts of the world is also quite different. I mean, you know, there's a very good book, I think, about the United States by Timothy Webb. I think is, I mean, it's not just the United States, by the way, it's also Britain. He calls it the 6-cylinder democracy, right? You know, people like cars, right? And they drive cars around, and that buys into the system. I think France was a 2-cylinder democracy. I don't know if it still is, right? Because of the deux chevaux. But you've basically got this idea of, you know, different degrees of loyalty to a system which is providing, you know, these consumption of commodities. Whether people need them or not, you can't really say, you know, because they do. I mean, we're not Puritans. I mean, people are, you know, can enjoy driving around sort of things, except now we do know it's destroying the planet. But, you know, at the time, that wasn't the actual critique. I mean, so what you've got is a development of this mass expansion of production, and commodity consumption is required in order to sustain the expansion of production. Yeah, completely agree.
Well, this is interesting, isn't it? The idea of false or artificial need, that's in Marcuse, isn't it? One-dimensional man.
Yeah,
I seem to remember in Volume 1 of Capital, Marx does say, well, we're talking about needs, but there is a sort of cultural element to this, as it were. It's not a sort of a natural, biological, physiological thing, or at least not only that. There is actually a historical, cultural, sociological component. So needs do change over time, and I think Marx does make that point in Volume 1.
Oh, absolutely. No, I think that's a very fair comment. I mean, so like TV, I mean, you can't, you know, it's just so socially, you would be depriving a person socially if you denied them a TV, and that's now it's a mobile phone. You know, I mean, you would be depriving people if they didn't have a mobile phone. So yeah, there's no fixity to it.
Tim, just before I turn to you, I've got to say this because I teach this, but the idea of false or artificial needs is in Thomas More's Utopia, so published in 1516. So, and I suspect it's in Plato's Republic as well, but I couldn't guarantee that. But it's certainly in More's Utopia. Tim.
I think I've forgotten the point I was going to. I mean, but following Andy's thing, you know, internet access is now a need. You know, but,
that's how we are social. Yeah, absolutely.
But just being a graphic designer and having taught typography and communications, there's whole areas going back to advertising. You know, the Empire Marketing Board. You know, the work of Scott sorry, I've forgotten the name. The American Knight McCalf. Come back to me. Who did an enormous amount of work promoting British imperial things, and this feeds into the unequal exchange and the shipping of products and the change of diet and tea, coffee, fruit, spices, things that weren't natural or culturally. To make you, following up your point, Tony, the change of cultural considerations of what was needed was actually created, manipulated, advocated to support that profitability in terms of exploitation channels across the world. Anyway, it's there's good stuff out there.
Right. Well, I think we've run out of time. I don't know unless anybody's got something pressing that they want to. I noticed, Chris, you posted something. Do you want to?
Oh, I missed that. Sorry.
Or something's just appeared. Actually, sorry.
Chris, there you go.
Sorry,
yeah.
There's a lot of noise because it's dinner time in our kitchen, so I've got a lot of background noise. I haven't been able to because I had boiling kettles and pans were banging around and things like that. Sorry. No, I think it's fascinating, this whole discussion, but it does to me tie into this question of symbolic value and how people value certain objects as use. And there's real work goes into that, producing that symbolic value, including socially productive value, which it comes back to that social reproduction part, which is really difficult to deal with in a Marxist framework. We talked about it in relation to health and education. Is it productive? Is it unproductive? Is it productive of a wider cultural good, or is it productive of some sort of use value that can be commodified and turned into exchange value? And that commodification of the symbolic and the cultural is something that's really significant, but I think is really difficult to build into this framework that Marx has got, because it wasn't as visible at the time that he was there. Although, yeah, the bit I popped into chat is something along the lines, Tony, the bit that you were talking about in volume 1 of uses of the fancies of the stomach or the mind or something like that. I think it picks up that idea of appetite. But I'm now wanting to do a Marxist analysis after this discussion of fine whiskies, because they're both put into storage for a really long time, but apparently that adds no value in this framework. So how could we account for the value of a 20-year-old single malt versus a 3-year-old? I don't know. That seems to me the critical political question today.
Yeah. I quite like that. Thank you very much for that, Chris. Right, we have run out of time. So thank you very much, Andy. Let's thank Andy in the usual way. And I must say, this is a testament to the quality of the discussion afterwards, which is, I think, obviously is just as important as the stimulating lecture. Taken together, it's a very productive thing. So thank you very much for stimulating it, Andy.
I want to be in Chris's kitchen. He's got fireworks there.
Okay. All right. Signing off until next time. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night and thank you.